I've been thinking a lot lately about the PlayStation 1 and what made it so special, and I can't help but wonder, what defines a console generation? Is it an extensive library of first-party games? Is it the ambitious stories those games seek to tell? Is it sales figures? Or is it community and our personal memories that have since resonated? To help me answer this question, I put out a tweet on the Penultimate Conquest Twitter and asked our followers what the PS1 generation means to them. Most people expectantly jump to their favorite games. Ruben mentions Crash Bandicoot and Final Fantasy VII, while Harley and Richie bring up Spyro the Dragon. Others mention the hardware. Hugo cites the addition of the memory card as a big contributor to what defined the PS1, while Hopefully Awesome talks about the long-forgotten demo disc. In a way, they're all right. A console is only as strong as the collection of games we value on the system. Games that mean something to us, and the tools we use to play them with. Whether good or bad, we hold those memories of play dear to us. But there are some aspects of games we don't often think of as generation-defining. Things such as genre, level design, or, in the case of this video, soundtracks. And yet, the PlayStation 1 had some of the most memorable soundtracks I've ever heard. Games like Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, Spyro, and Parasite Eve curated an elevated tone and presence through their specific use of their soundtracks. And yet, there are a subset of games that help define the PlayStation generation further than any of the titles previously mentioned. Games with soundtracks within a specific subgenre of electronic. A subgenre that shaped the identity of how we think about the console as cool, confident, and rebellious. Soundtracks with heavy bass and bouncy beats and fast drums and hypnotic rhythms with claps and synths and hi-hats and... I'm talking, of course, about drum and bass, but what is D&B? In the late 80s and early 90s, DJs around the UK in the underground rave and house scene began experimenting with variations of hardcore and techno. These tracks prioritized heavy bass and breakbeat percussion at an insanely high pace of upwards of 180 beats per minute. As DJs began incorporating different looping samples and synthesizers into their mix, the evolution and growing popularity in the proto-genre would lead to an eventual split into various subgenres such as liquid, jungle, and intelligent. In the subsequent years, in order to avoid stigma with the counterculture surrounding jungle and its association with crime and violence, producers distanced themselves and created one encompassing genre, which we now call drum and bass. And while you may be thinking, that's cool, but why should I care? Well, influences from drum and bass are making their way back into more mainstream genres such as pop and hip-hop. Dipping into the underground electronic scene, you'll find producers like DJ Seinfeld and DJ Boring taking influences from Liquid to make fast, dreamy, ethereal mixes. Fans of modern drum and bass can point you to Andy C., DRS, or Spindall for conversations about sick producers. And of course, greats like Aphex Twin continue to inspire and be inspired by the D&B genre. You can even find influences reaching modern pop with the likes of Charlie XCX, as well as modern hip-hop utilizing more breakbeat drums and snares, like with Tottenham rapper AJ Tracey. And, of course, if you're on TikTok, you may have heard bedroom pop singer PinkPantheress singing over an Andy C track to create her song, Break It Off. I'm sure you've heard it before. All these examples are to say, drum and bass didn't just come and go. And it didn't just evolve back into the influences from which it came. In the YouTube series Drum and Bass Diaries, UK producer Clute says that the genre has grown worldwide. Chances are you've heard it before and didn't recognize you were listening to some kind of amorphous form of D&B. What makes the genre so special, however, is that while drum and bass has reached global affinity, the spirit of it has persisted primarily underground, making it feel special when you find a song in the genre, as if you've discovered a song nobody else has ever heard before. It's these small characteristics as we know them today that make drum and bass so cool to listen to, elevating the medium into something different, something cool and unique. But what does that look like in games? Let's take a look at some specific examples found in the original PlayStation that may point us in the direction of how music can inform a game's identity.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that? You got a real...
It's hard to be different. It's even harder to stand out and make a name for yourself. Yet in 1994, Sony was able to do just that with their very own video game console in a market already dominated by another Japanese conglomerate, Nintendo. After being abandoned by Nintendo, the project to introduce CD-ROMs as a medium for video games saw Sony take the project and create their own home console that would compete with Nintendo's products, one with 3D environments and full motion graphics. With that, the original PlayStation was born. But it wasn't enough that the tech was new. The games on the console, and thus the console's identity, had to be cool and desired by players across the world. And similar to Sega's response to Mario with the creation of Sonic, a quirky, harsh-edged hedgehog with an attitude designed to be antithetical to a round, whimsical Mario, so too was it necessary for the PlayStation to reach a level of aloofness and mystique. And I think it was successful. Crash Bandicoot was a mean, rambunctious mascot. Metal Gear Solid was a mature, thoughtful take on espionage games. And Final Fantasy was a beautiful, critically acclaimed RPG epic. All these games, and more, worked to create a sense of PlayStation's identity, that this console was the only place to get games you needed to play. But it isn't just the tentpole titles that inspired the PlayStation console we look back on today. For a select few, it was actually the soundtrack that contributed to the concept of identity. Drum and bass is special in that its use of breakbeat drums and high BPM gives the music the impression of being futuristic. If PlayStation wanted to establish themselves against their competitors as the future of gaming, then nowhere is this better on display than with the futuristic racer Wipeout. And futurity makes sense here. In a game where hover cars race through the landscape of a utopian city, then having a matching soundtrack to meet the intended mood makes sense. And what better way to make a game feel faster than by accompanying each course with a heart-pounding, fist-pumping electronic soundtrack. But this same aesthetic isn't just reserved for games set in the future. Think back to Gran Turismo and you may remember its then graphical fidelity and smooth ambient music found when shopping for in-game cars. But load into a track and you'll find the same drum and bass music of a Wipeout, high BPM, an abundance of hi-hats, and swirling synths. With these two racers sharing similar aesthetics in terms of tone, I think this is a sign that begins to demarcate the PlayStation from any other console. A a road sign that the future of games isn't just here, but that it's cool and exclusive to the Sony platform. But drum and bass isn't just exclusive to racing games. You'll find its reaches in games like Spyro the Dragon, Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster, Frogger, and Pac-Man World. And did you know, there was even a music production software available on the PlayStation called Music 2000? A quick YouTube search of the game nets you several user-made jungle tracks that fit straight into the very aesthetic we're interrogating, like this one uploaded by Old School Beats called Techno Jam. But perhaps our best example of drum and bass in games comes with Japan Studios' quirky classic, Ape Escape. For the uninitiated, Ape Escape follows Spike on his journey through time to catch escapee monkeys, led by their sentient ape leader, Spectre. It's a silly premise, but its satisfying gameplay loop is only made better by its accompanying soundtrack, led by the game's composer, Soichi Terada. Nowhere in this game are you left without feeling a sense of the future, even as you travel back deeper in time. From fighting dinosaurs in the Mesozoic era, to platforming along the Great Wall in Ming Dynasty China, and everywhere in between. Each level is underscored with the drums, synths, and sounds of futuristic drum and bass. Essentially, it's electronic Doctor Who. I have to give a special shout out here to the music of Spike's Time Station that I can't think of how to describe other than melancholy dream techno, and a hub world that should truly be experienced. It's D&B through and through, even in the areas you'd least expect. But what effect does this music have for Ape Escape? Much like Wipeout and Gran Turismo, so too does Ape Escape evoke a sense of futurity. You see that present not just in the prehistoric levels, but in the training rooms, Jake's challenges, Time Station, and more. But beyond that, the music resembles the rebellious spirit you get not just playing as our spiky-haired protagonist, but that of the console you're playing it on, the underdog, the outcast. I can't begin to describe the feeling of chasing down an escaping monkey, beating him with a neon saber, and feeling the modulated crunch of finally catching him in your net, all while heavy drums bounce you along to a fast rhythmic beat. Moments like this do indeed elicit an emotional response that escapes perfect description, like feeling nostalgic for something that hasn't quite happened yet. These elements all may feel antithetical to one another, but somehow still work. It's strange, the thought of rafting through an in-game forest to the sounds of kick drums and synthesizers, but they somehow work perfectly together. I think that's the beauty of what drum and bass helps bring to Ape Escape. The attitude of a misfit and wandering adolescent, made cool through music. Put simply, as you play, the songs make both the game, and in turn the gamer, feel cooler. And for that we have to credit Terada. However, Soichi Terada didn't just help give identity to Ape Escape. He also helped embody the spirit of D&B in future Sony titles, and with it, the PlayStation ecosystem altogether. I'd like to take a second to tell you more about Terada's lead up to working in scoring games. Terada is an electronic artist and composer from Tokyo, Japan. After graduating from the University of Electrocommunications, Terada focused on producing house music, sending demos to various electronic and hip-hop labels, unfortunately, to no avail. That same year, Terada met another DJ, one of the unsung heroes of house in Japan, Shinichiro Yokota, hitting it off and eventually forming their own record label, Far East Recordings. Then in 1995, Terada released his D&B album, Sumo Jungle, a collection of energetic synths and samples that would see Terada find clout and acclaim. After lead game director on Ape Escape took a liking to the album, Terada was asked to compose the soundtrack to the game. Terada took a liking to the game's premise and, after demoing the game, finally agreed to make the music for it. I think this is one of the reasons why we look back at Ape Escape so fondly. It wasn't enough that the game had great level design and a satisfying gameplay loop, but that the accompanying soundtrack elevated each individual aspect of the game to create the classic title we think of today. Sony Japan may have developed the game, but Terada gave it its identity. If there is a version of the original Ape Escape without Terada, I hope I never play it. Okay, at this point you may be wondering, but how does a game's music influence a console, let alone its identity? And while I'll do my best to explicate musical identity through the elements that make up the genre, I'd be remiss not to mention that a huge factor of drum and bass is the feeling you get while listening to it. I understand this can be subjective, so I encourage you to really feel the music as I continue to expound on drum and bass in games. I'll also include a playlist of music below if you'd like to take my reading and apply it to your own specific examples. For me, the spirit of both the PlayStation and drum and bass are somewhat parallel. If we take into consideration the PlayStation's origin as an experimental rejection from Nintendo, then every game published on the PlayStation thus feels like an iconoclast rebuttal. And when combined with drum and bass, these games take on the spirit of something resembling counterculture. While Mario jumps to uplifting, if but childlike keys, it's the drum and bass of games like Ape Escape and Wipeout that feel non-conforming and rebellious. As I race through the chicanes and asphalt of Gran Turismo, I think of the rapid bouncing of the backbeat, and I can't help but feel like a gaming misfit as I lose myself in the world embodied by the music. Don't get me wrong, PlayStation isn't the only console to have made games with memorable soundtracks. Nintendo has made some of the best video game soundtracks I've ever heard. I still jam heavy to Donkey Kong's aquatic ambience, and I can't help but get emotional whenever I hear the startup music to Ocarina of Time. And yet, it doesn't have this. So while we may feel nostalgic for the classic themes of Zelda, Mario 64, and Star Fox, and rightfully so, the soundtracks of these PlayStation 1 games conversely feel futuristic, even 25 years later. And I think that's part of what makes DnB so cool. There's something inviting about the liminal space that exists between fast-hitting drums and smooth synths that feel as if you're entering a sonic landscape that feels both alien and familiar. It's the attitude these soundtracks help create that embody the spirit of the PlayStation and thus define the console. These dreamlike electro beats of yester inform not only the experience you have in the moment, but everything that comes after hitting start.
How do you make it go?
Push the start button.
I knew that.
All right.
I got it.
In an interview with Electronic Beats magazine, Charlie McDermott Edwards says that Japan's obsession with techno culture made a big impact on the video game music of the 90s. Games like Ghost in the Shell, Megatech Body, Roll Cage, and Sledstorm saw electronic heavyweights place their styles from the music scene into games. I think the fact that house music made its way into the library of games beyond just first-party titles works to set a tone amongst the PlayStation audience. If drum and bass is the misfit nonconformist of music, then its abundant presence in PlayStation altogether works to separate it from the stigma associated with other home consoles. That the PS1 was a location beyond just games for kids, but a cyberpunk club of entertainment for teens and adults alike. Consumers saw the PlayStation as the future, having musicians like Terada and Takeo Shino working on your games helps elevate that sense of futurity when debating cartridges versus CDs. I can't help but think that Sony's cool aesthetic in some way helped influence sales figures, leading the PS1 to outsell the Nintendo 64 by over 70 million units. And in many ways, this same attitude has persisted along PlayStation generations. Take the startup of the PlayStation 2 and you'll feel like you're transported into a geometric landscape of the future. Or boot up the PSP and suddenly you're inundated with a slick, utopian jingle. Even the marketing leading up to the PlayStation 5's reveal leaned heavily into futuristic aesthetics, utilizing heavy bass and synth-led beats during pre-show livestreams, and alien-esque graphic packages to interlude trailers. These aesthetics haven't just persisted, they've evolved and become legacy for PlayStation. Whether it be its line of games, studios, or soundtracks, the foundation is still the same: identity. I can't help but think that the drum and bass tracks of the PS1, in at least some small part, helped Sony establish that identity. And although we don't necessarily hear the same exact elements of D&B in modern games, it doesn't mean the aesthetics have persisted into other forms. If drum and bass was the revolution of the electronic world of the late 80s and early 90s, then its evolution in the music space has occurred right alongside future console generations. Maybe we just haven't taken close enough attention. For example, Wipeout 2048 on the PS Vita, developed by now dissolved studio Liverpool, features an opening cinematic emblematic of the concept of identity we've been analyzing, following the evolution of race cars from the 1940s all the way to the hover cars of 2048. The song, Louder by DJ Fresh, combines elements of electronic music to reflect its theme of technological progression, utilizing the lead vocals emphasized in house, along with a fast backbeat and hi-hats of drum and bass, as well as the bass wobbles of dubstep. Some games like DMC and Devil May Cry 5 utilize these same high BPM electronic tracks to emphasize its hyper-stylization and its quick gameplay. Others, like Hitman 2 and 3's club levels, use the same genre to reaffirm its tone within the game's location. Walking through a crowd of sweaty, dancing Berliners as the bass fills your ears and lasers flash along the screen doesn't just work to immerse the player in the setting, but makes the players feel insidious as they make their way to the assassination targets. I could go on about the fast electronic beats of racers like Motorsport and Drive Club, tell you about the use of suppressed techno to highlight setting in Detroit Become Human, as well as to reaffirm aesthetic in CD Projekt's Cyberpunk 2077, but to do so would belabor the point. Electronic music in gaming has persisted much longer than we typically give it credit for. And as far as PlayStation is concerned, it all starts with the genre-defining soundtracks of the PS1. There are certainly a myriad of elements that define the PlayStation generation. After all, music is just one aspect that makes up a game. And you certainly are wrong for perhaps thinking of some of the best games of the console first when I ask what defined the PlayStation. Instead, I want us to consider how music can elevate a game past its immediate moment-to-moment gameplay to transcend medium to create some sense of aesthetic. And in the case of drum and bass, that aesthetic is mostly clear. Sony wanted the PlayStation to represent the future. Without these electronic soundtracks, I don't think they would have been as successful. Whether it be dubstep, techno, or house, electronic plays a huge role in establishing a sense of identity in the games that we play. It sets tone, setting, and most importantly, interpolates the player into the game by inundating them with its various instruments. Without it, we wouldn't feel like we were driving as fast in a racer, partying as hard in an action-adventure, or catching monkeys as cool in an old platformer. And we can thank drum and bass for that. So whether we're nostalgic for the hums of CRTs or eagerly anticipating the greatness that awaits, you should allow yourself to be submerged in the sonic landscape PlayStation seeks to create. Delve into the oceans of synthesizers and hi-hats. Next time you wait in a pre-show livestream, think of who PlayStation asserts themselves to be in the video game space, and how far they've come from the breakbeats of drum and bass. And no matter which Sony console may be your favorite, we can all agree, the heart of PlayStation has always been its vibe. And if you listen closely, you just might be able to hear it. It's just moving at 180 beats per minute.